First, dinosaurs. Ancient Earth, no humans, and caterpillars the size of a person. Yes, there really was a chapter of our planet that unhinged. Dragonflies weren't big, they were absurd, wings spanning around a meter. Fern-like plants reached 50 meters high, and that entire era of oversized life ended up shaping something you'd never expect, the way humanity later entered the Industrial Revolution. The gap is about 350 million years, but the causal link is real, and in the next couple of minutes, we'll walk through it, along with the weirdest stretch of Earth's timeline. So smash like, because this is going to be one of those wait, what journeys. This is Secret Chapter. Let's go. Before we dive in, we need the baseline. Earth, in its default settings, is a CO2 planet. If you rewind far enough, roughly 4 billion years, you land in a world where oxygen is basically absent, less than 0.001% of the air. And that isn't some special Earth anomaly. Look at Mars, look at Venus. That's how rocky planets tend to work. Volcanoes dominate early geology, and volcanoes breathe out carbon dioxide. From a chemistry perspective, CO2 is annoyingly stable. UV doesn't shred it easily, radiation doesn't casually erase it, and it's easy to generate because carbon is one of the most common construction materials in the universe. So, on most planets, CO2 naturally accumulates in the atmosphere. Now, here's the myth we need to delete. People imagine early Earth as a perpetual blackout, thick, choking air, smoke everywhere, the sun barely visible behind a dirty ceiling of gas and ash. But the numbers don't fully support that picture. In Australia in 2016, researchers found ancient lava flows from that early violent era, and inside the rock, tiny bubbles of trapped air survived like time capsules. Those bubbles can tell you atmospheric composition and pressure, and the signal they gave is wild. Around 2.7 billion years ago, Earth's atmospheric pressure may have been roughly half of what it is now, possibly even lower. That sounds like trivia until you realize how many rules it rewrites. Boiling point, for example. With pressure cut in half, water doesn't wait for 100 degrees Celsius. It boils closer to 80 degrees Celsius, which means early Earth wasn't just Earth but older. It behaved like a different planet. And that matters most when you talk about life, because every time our tools get better, life shows up on the timeline. Darwin, in 1859, put it at 548 million years. Mid-20th century textbooks pushed it to 3.4 billion, and by 2025, using microbial genomes, researchers argue the last universal common ancestor, Luca, lived as far back as 4.330 billion years ago. So, Luca belongs to that low-pressure, oxygen-free Earth, which makes us, oxygen breathers, the weird newcomers. If the planet's first 2 billion years of organisms had opinions, they'd probably label us dirty blood, just for liking oxygen. Sure, that's dramatic, they were simple life forms, but the event that followed proves the point. The Great Oxygenation, around 2.4 billion years ago, hit the existing biosphere like a disaster movie. Cyanobacteria cracked the style of photosynthesis we're familiar with, and the waste product they released was oxygen, a molecule that for many early organisms wasn't life-giving at all. It was a toxin.
Ask anyone who's owned an old car what oxygen does to metal. It doesn't age it, it consumes it, turning clean steel into rust through oxidation. Early Earth life met the same enemy. We survived because evolution eventually equipped our ancestors with chemical bodyguards, enzymes like superoxide dismutase, letting organisms not only tolerate oxygen, but weaponize it for aerobic breathing. And here's the uncomfortable thought. It didn't have to happen. The oxygen shift wasn't destiny, it was a chaotic accident. If that runaway oxygen event never spiraled, the planet's biosphere could have taken a completely different path. Sure, oxygen respiration delivers roughly 18 times the energy, but lab work and modeling suggest you can still build complex multicellular life in a CO2-heavy world that looks more like early Earth. We even see hints of that today. Yeast can organize into snowflake clusters, piling up into cooperative survival shapes. Some worms and microbial mats still run their whole lives without O2, which is why it's fair to say oxygen is a late arrival, a guest, and oxygen-based life is, in a very real sense, the executioner of what came before. Please don't mention that to the yeast in your kitchen, though, or they'll start demanding compensation. Now that we've earned the context, we can move forward. As photosynthetic microbes multiplied and outcompeted everything around them, oxygen started creeping into the sky, but it didn't explode overnight into dinosaurs and anime. It crawled, painfully. Around 1.5 billion years ago, atmospheric oxygen sat near 2%. By roughly 850 million years ago, it was about 10%. And only around 542 million years ago do we reliably see the first organisms that feel like animals in the modern sense. So Darwin wasn't wildly off, he was just missing the deeper timeline. This is the era when fossils like Dickinsonia, Spergina, Kimberella, and their weird neighbors begin showing up in force, and their appearance tracks the ongoing oxygen rise. A huge part of that oxygen story belongs to plants. Once they established themselves on land, they got aggressive about stripping CO2 and pumping out O2, basically unlocking the possibility of larger bodies. Then, around 350 million years ago, the world flips into monster mode. Oxygen doesn't just rise, it spikes. Estimates put it near 35% compared to about 21% today. That level wouldn't instantly drop a human, but living in it long term would still stress lungs and the nervous system. With modern medicine, we'd probably manage, and in practice, for humans, pressure often matters more than the percentage. Ask any diver or climber. But most living things aren't built with our flexibility. A lot of modern groups, birds, mollusks, and plenty of mammals, would start disappearing fast in that high oxygen environment. Insects, though? Insects would thrive because they're running a different respiratory design, the tracheal system. Most animals breathe through lungs and then depend on circulation and a pile of finicky air-sensitive processes. Insects skip that complexity. They use tube networks that deliver oxygen directly to tissues, so they aren't stressed by extra oxygen. They basically treat it like a free upgrade. As long as it isn't lower, higher is simply better.
More oxygen-reaching tissues means one simple thing for insects: the size limit moves upward. And during the Carboniferous, when oxygen hovered around 35%, that limit got absolutely demolished. Dragonflies weren't large, they were aircraft. Meganeura cruised with wingspans approaching a full meter, and the fossil record still hands us proof of Arthropleura, a millipede so long it hits 2.5 meters like it's nothing. And no, these creatures weren't harmless little herbivores. Researchers argue that both the giant insects and their equally giant neighbors weren't picky. They could take animal prey too, including small amphibians. But that's not even the worst part. In the forest, you might run into a scorpion pushing a meter long, Pulmonoscorpius, or a spider big enough to be mistaken for a plate. The truly unsettling twist is that the weather wasn't some alien extreme. In many ways, the climate sits surprisingly close to modern Earth. The planet wasn't unrecognizable, it was familiar Earth, populated by unfamiliar monsters. And if the land is bad, the water is worse. Aquatic ecosystems start previewing the kind of giantism we later associate with dinosaurs. You get Eogearinus, around 5 meters. You get sharks that push 15 meters in some reconstructions. You get Rhizodus, an 8-meter fish found in regions that today are part of Russia. Just a fish, except the latest estimates put it around 1.5 tons. Some paleontologists even argue it could snap up prey near the shoreline. So yes, if you ever build a time machine, don't go strolling along Carboniferous riverbanks like it's a park. Because Rhizodus isn't your only problem. There's Hibertopterus, and it's nightmare fuel, especially because the patterns on its back look like creepy human faces the way a child would draw them. Evolution's bad joke, attached to a body close to 2 meters long with a clear appetite for meat. Picture it, a scorpion sized like a person gliding through cloudy water in an ancient lagoon, huge claws opening and closing, either pinning prey or shoveling through mud. That thing, and things like it, spread across the planet and lived comfortably. Now add the final ingredient, forests. Massive tropical forests inhaling CO2 and growing into insane biomass. And for time travelers, the important detail is that they were also excellent fuel. Oxygen levels were almost double today's, so every spark had the potential to become a catastrophe. And once a fire started, putting it out was nearly impossible. Around 300 million years ago, Earth burned, constantly, aggressively. And what's wild is that even relentless fire couldn't erase the sheer volume of plant material. Not fire, not weather, not even time itself. Today, dead leaves vanish fast because microbes and decomposers swarm them. Back then, decomposition couldn't keep up. Everything was huge, and the ecosystem lacked enough recycling capacity. So dead plants stacked up in layers, sealing the lower levels from air and water. Pressure increased. Water got squeezed out at the bottom. With more piling on top, heat and pressure climbed, and the buried organic matter slowly lost oxygen, hydrogen, and other volatile components.
What remained was mostly carbon. And that carbon is sitting in the ground right now, under our feet, with a name you know perfectly well: coal.
That's why we call it the Carboniferous in the first place. The planet ran a high oxygen mode. Plants grew like crazy, and the dead biomass piled up until it turned into coal. And roughly 90% of the coal we use today traces back to that pipeline and that era. Now, pause and connect the dots to modern history. Why didn't the Roman world kick off an industrial revolution? One boring reason beats 1,000 Romans were different theories. Geology. Much of the rock around Rome is relatively young, and coal isn't abundant, so they relied on wood. Weaker fuel, harder to scale, and without cheap, dense energy underfoot, nobody is obsessing over steam engines and mass mechanization. Britain got the opposite lottery ticket. Its geology is older, and Carboniferous deposits are often absurdly accessible, sometimes practically a shovel down. And there's a reason for that too. Around 300 million years ago, Britain sat closer to the equator and behaved like a hot swamp belt of the planet. Perfect conditions for turning endless plant mass into future coal. People in Britain were heating homes with coal long before Industrial Revolution was even a phrase. So when steam technology finally became imaginable, the fuel wasn't a theoretical resource. It was a known, familiar thing sitting right under their feet. And that's the quietly insane takeaway. Tiny, ancient ecosystems, trilobites and swamp forests from 300 million years ago helped shape the future political map of Europe and the entire trajectory of human industry. Because the energy ladder starts there. Coal to oil to gas to nuclear. Remove coal from the early steps and history might look completely different. Maybe we'd still be burning forests at scale and calling it progress. After the peak, oxygen doesn't stay that high. It starts dropping. Part of it is self-inflicted. Plants stripped so much CO2 that the planet cooled, even flirted with global glaciation because CO2 is a major heat-trapping gas. And part of it is geology striking back. As Pangea formed, volcanism surged, changing the atmospheric balance again. The end result is wild. Early dinosaurs moved through an atmosphere that could dip to around 15% oxygen. Only much later, closer to the Cenozoic, does oxygen settle into the modern baseline of about 21%. If you want more deep past modern world connections like this, tell me with a like and a comment. New video soon. See you next time.